Hi there. Tonight we unravel the intricate, often veiled world of what dating was like for Victorian women. Imagine yourself as a young woman in a bustling Victorian drawing room, perhaps feeling the nervous flutter of anticipation as a potential suitor approaches. Every glance, every carefully chosen word, and every polite gesture holds immense weight, for this isn't a casual date as we understand it today. This is courtship, a highly formalized dance with very high stakes where a single misstep could spell social ruin. You probably wouldn't survive a single awkward encounter without a smelling salt and a detailed etiquette guide. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do feel free to post where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe, turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your path to marriage begins not with dating, but with courtship, not dating, formalized introductions. Forget swiping right or meeting for coffee. For you, a Victorian woman, the concept of dating in the modern sense simply didn't exist. Instead, you engaged in a highly structured and socially sanctioned process known as courtship, a formal preliminary period of acquaintance between a man and a woman who are considering marriage. This period began, almost without exception, with a proper introduction, usually facilitated by a family member, a mutual friend, or a trusted acquaintance. You wouldn't just meet a man at a party and go out with him alone. Such an act would be scandalous and immediately compromise your reputation. The introduction often took place at a social gathering, a ball, a formal dinner, or during orchestrated social calls where families assessed each other. This mainstream historical fact, the absolute necessity of formalized introductions as the starting point for any potential romantic connection, was the bedrock of Victorian courtship for respectable women. Historians still argue whether this system of formalized introductions primarily served to protect young women from unsuitable matches and exploitation, or if it limited their agency and forced them into relationships based on social and economic considerations rather than genuine affection. It's a bit like being handed a meticulously curated menu and being told you can only choose from those options. You might find something palatable, but true discovery is rare. You might find yourself observing a potential suitor from across a crowded room, relying on your chaperone or your parents to provide background information, knowing that a direct, unmediated approach was simply not an option. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some families even employed matchmakers, usually respectable older women, who would discreetly assess potential matches and arrange introductions, almost like a human algorithm for marital suitability. Imagine having a professional social engineer determining your romantic prospects, the quiet exchange of pleasantries, the careful assessment of family backgrounds, and the implicit understanding that every introduction was a step towards a potential future, defined your initial encounters. This formalized system, far from offering spontaneous romance, was a carefully orchestrated dance of social propriety, where every move was scrutinized and your future happiness often depended on navigating these intricate social rules with utmost grace and precision. Your life, your future, all began with a proper, formal handshake and a polite nod. Once an introduction was made, your interactions with a potential suitor were rarely, if ever, private. This brings us to chaperonage, constant supervision. Imagine trying to have a romantic conversation or a flirtatious moment, always keenly aware of the watchful eyes and ears of a third party, typically an older, unmarried female relative or a trusted governess. This ever-present guardian was the uninvited but absolutely essential guest on every date. You see, for Victorian women, maintaining an unblemished reputation was paramount, and any hint of impropriety could spell social ruin, unchaperoned. Meetings between unmarried men and women were simply not permitted, as they were seen as opportunities for moral transgression and potential scandal. Your chaperone's role was to ensure that conversations remained decorous. Physical contact was strictly avoided and no compromising situations arose. She would accompany you to social gatherings, on walks in the park, to concerts, or even during formal visits to your home. Her presence was a constant reminder of societal expectations and a deterrent against any behavior that might be deemed forward or inappropriate. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive and absolute requirement for chaperonage during any interaction between unmarried men and women, was a defining characteristic of Victorian courtship. Historians still argue whether chaperonage primarily protected young women from sexual predation and unwanted advances in a society with few legal safeguards, or if it was a restrictive tool that stifled genuine romantic connection, individuality, and female autonomy. It's a bit like being allowed to go to a party, but only if your extremely strict aunt is glued to your side the entire evening. It might keep you out of trouble, but it certainly limits your fun. You might find yourself carefully modulating your voice, avoiding direct eye contact that could be misinterpreted, or subtly communicating through coded gestures, all while your chaperone sat nearby, ostensibly engrossed in a book or needlework, but missing nothing. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some particularly astute chaperones would strategically position themselves to ensure they could hear every word exchanged, sometimes even timing the duration of conversations to ensure no undue familiarity developed. Imagine having a human stopwatch for your romantic encounters. The quiet rustle of your chaperone's dress, the subtle clearing of her throat, or her perfectly timed interjection would be a constant, gentle reminder of her presence and your constrained liberties. This unyielding system of constant supervision meant that privacy was a luxury you simply couldn't afford during courtship. Every conversation, every shared glance, every polite laugh was performed on a public stage, making dating a highly controlled, anxious, and deeply observed performance, where your chaperone was always the most important audience member. With chaperones ever present, the initial steps of courtship relied heavily on a highly formalized system of introductions and social etiquette. This brings us to calling cards, ritualized social entry. Imagine the delicate exchange of engraved cards, a seemingly simple act that for you, a Victorian woman, served as the formal gateway to potential romantic connections and established your family's social standing. You see, for the middle and upper classes, calling or visiting was a cornerstone of Victorian social life, and calling cards were its currency. If a gentleman wished to make your acquaintance after a formal introduction at a ball, or if his family wished to signal their interest, he or his mother on his behalf would leave his calling card at your family's residence. This wasn't a casual drop-by. It was a precise ritual. The card would be left at the door, perhaps with a corner turned down, to indicate a personal visit rather than just a formal delivery. Your mother would then decide whether to receive him, meaning invite him to call, again at an appointed time, or to merely return his card, politely signaling no interest. This mainstream historical fact, the indispensable role of calling cards and the elaborate rituals surrounding their exchange, was the primary formal mechanism through which initial social and romantic connections were initiated and managed. For Victorian women, historians still argue whether this system primarily ensured social compatibility and prevented unsuitable matches, or if it created a rigid, impersonal barrier to genuine emotional connection, reducing potential partners to entries in a social ledger. It's a bit like trying to decide if a very formal job application process filters out bad candidates or just discourages creative ones. It's efficient, but perhaps lacks nuance. You might find yourself waiting anxiously for your mother to review a stack of calling cards, wondering which names held the promise of an interesting conversation, or perhaps a future partner, understanding that this seemingly small piece of paper held immense power over your social destiny. Here's a quirky tidbit. The design of calling cards could be surprisingly elaborate, featuring embossed crests, delicate engravings, or even subtly coded messages in their typography or imagery, offering hints about the caller's personality or intentions. Imagine trying to decipher a suitor's character from the font on his card. The quiet rustle of a new calling card being placed on the silver tray in your hall, the whispered discussions with your mother about its sender, and the careful decision to invite a return call all formed part of the elaborate dance of Victorian courtship. This ritualized entry into your social circle, far from being spontaneous, was a deeply significant act, setting the stage for future interactions and placing the initial power of acceptance or rejection firmly in your family's hands. Your journey into the world of eligible bachelors began with this tiny, engraved piece of paper. Once initial connections were established through calling cards, your interactions with potential suitors moved into carefully designated arenas. This brings us to public venues, safe socializing spaces. Imagine yourself at a bustling garden party, a crowded exhibition, or a formal concert. These weren't places for intimate tete-a-tete, but rather carefully curated environments where you could meet and converse with eligible gentlemen under the watchful eye of society. You see, for Victorian women, private, unchaperoned meeting with men were taboo. Therefore, public venues became the primary legitimate spaces for courtship to unfold. Balls and dances allowed for polite conversation and regulated physical proximity through dancing. Concerts and theatrical performances offered opportunities for shared cultural experiences and conversation during intermissions. Public parks and gardens were popular for supervised strolls, while exhibitions, museums, and even lectures provided intellectual common ground. These spaces were considered safe because they were open, populated by respectable society, and implicitly governed by strict rules of decorum. Any overt flirtation or inappropriate behavior would be immediately noticed and condemned, making them ideal for controlled interaction. This mainstream historical fact, the reliance on public, highly supervised venues for courtship, was crucial for maintaining a Victorian woman's reputation. Historians still argue whether the use of public venues primarily stifled genuine personal connection, turning courtship into a performance, or if it provided a necessary framework for interaction in a society deeply concerned with moral propriety. It's a bit like trying to have a romantic conversation in the middle of a very busy train station. You can talk, but true intimacy is hard to achieve amidst the constant observation. You might find yourself making polite conversation about the weather or the latest social event, keenly aware of your surroundings and discreetly observing your suitor's manners and conversational skills, knowing that every interaction was subtly judged. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some popular public spaces, like specific sections of Hyde Park in London, became known as prime locations for marriage parades, where eligible young ladies and gentlemen would promenade specifically to see and be seen, almost like a human showroom. Imagine taking a daily stroll with the explicit, though unspoken, purpose of finding a spouse. The quiet rustle of dresses and suits, the murmur of polite conversation, and the constant, subtle assessment of social standing filled these carefully managed public spaces. These public venues, far from offering private romance, were vital stages for the performance of courtship, allowing you to engage with potential suitors within the confines of societal expectations, all while under the benevolent, or sometimes stifling gaze of the wider Victorian world. Your interactions, while constrained, were carefully designed to lead towards the ultimate goal, a respectable marriage. For you, a Victorian woman navigating the marriage market, certain times of the year were far more significant than others for meeting eligible bachelors. This brings us to the social season, marriage market peak. Imagine the flurry of activity as winter gives way to spring and London transforms into a whirlwind of balls, soirees, and opera nights. This wasn't just about entertainment. It was the designated period when aristocratic and wealthy families converged in the city explicitly for the purpose of finding suitable matches for their children. You see, for the upper echelons of Victorian society, the season, typically running from roughly April to July, was the absolute pinnacle of social activity and, crucially, the prime time for courtship. Families would move from their country estates to their townhouses in London, dedicating themselves to a relentless schedule of parties, dinners, dances, and public events like Rotten Row rides in Hyde Park. Daughters of marriageable age would be formally presented at court, signalling their eligibility. This intense period offered the maximum number of opportunities to be seen, to meet potential suitors, and for families to conduct discreet inquiries into backgrounds and finances. Failure to make a match during the season could lead to anxiety in the prospect of waiting another year. This mainstream historical fact, the pivotal role of the London social season as a concentrated marriage market, was a defining feature of courtship for elite Victorian women. Historians still argue whether the intense, competitive nature of the season primarily ensured strategic and financially advantageous marriages, or if it placed immense pressure on young women, turning the pursuit of a husband into a stressful, almost transactional endeavor. It's a bit like a high-stakes auction, where you're both the bidder and the item for sale. Exhilarating for some, terrifying for others. You might find yourself exhausted by the relentless rounds of social engagements, attempting to balance polite conversation with strategic flirtation, all while your mother meticulously tracked your dance card and assessed the eligibility of every gentleman who approached. Here's a quirky tidbit. To cope with the sheer volume of social engagements, some debutantes, young women formally entering society, would keep detailed engagement diaries, not just for parties, but to track which suitor they saw on which day, ensuring they gave equal attention to promising prospects. Imagine needing a literal spreadsheet to manage your romantic life. The quiet rustle of ball gowns, the murmur of polite gossip, and the unspoken tension of the marriage market filled these intense months. This concentrated period of social activity meant that your efforts to secure a husband were compressed into a few frantic months, making it a demanding, high-pressure, yet utterly central part of what dating entailed for a Victorian woman.
Of means, every dance, every smile, every carefully placed word was a potential step towards your future.
Amidst the formal gatherings and the watchful eyes of chaperones, Victorian women developed subtle, coded ways to express their feelings and preferences. This brings us to the language of flowers, coded messages. Imagine receiving a carefully arranged bouquet from a suitor. This wasn't just a pretty gift. Every bloom, every color, and even its arrangement held a secret meaning, allowing you to both send and receive sentiments that couldn't be openly spoken. You see, in a society where overt declarations of affection were deemed improper, especially from women, the language of flowers, or floriography, became a popular and nuanced method of communication. Nearly every flower, herb, and even certain ways of arranging them carried a specific symbolic meaning. A red rose, of course, meant love, but a yellow rose could signify friendship or even jealousy. A sprig of rosemary might convey remembrance, while a lily of the valley meant return of happiness. Sending or receiving certain flowers, or combining them in specific ways, allowed suitors and ladies to send discreet messages of admiration, rejection, hope, or warning without uttering a single, potentially compromising word. This mainstream historical fact, the widespread use and understanding of floriography as a non-verbal communication tool, was an integral, if subtle, part of Victorian courtship. Historians still argue whether the language of flowers primarily offered a romantic and expressive outlet in a repressed society, or if it further complicated communication, leading to misunderstandings and anxieties about correctly interpreting subtle signals. It's a bit like trying to navigate a minefield where every step could convey a disastrous message, charming, yes, but also incredibly stressful. You might find yourself eagerly consulting your floriography dictionary after receiving a bouquet, trying to decipher if the gentleman truly harbored deep affection or was merely expressing polite admiration, perhaps wondering if that single wilted daisy meant despair, or just that he'd forgotten to put it in water. Here's a quirky tidbit. Specialized flower dictionaries were widely published during the Victorian era, allowing both men and women to meticulously craft and decode these floral messages, sometimes leading to humorous or heartbreaking misinterpretations. Imagine your mother, armed with her trusty flower dictionary, meticulously dissecting every petal of a bouquet sent to you, trying to uncover its true meaning. The quiet rustle of paper as you turned the pages of your floral dictionary, the soft scent of blossoms and the careful placement of each stem allowed for a silent yet deeply expressive dialogue. This charming yet complex system of coded communication meant that even the simple act of receiving flowers was a significant event, a coded exchange of feelings that shaped the unspoken narrative of your courtship, where every bloom told a story. Beyond the silent language of flowers, much of your interaction with a potential suitor unfolded in a medium that required patience and careful articulation. This brings us to correspondence, letter-based courtship. Imagine the flutter in your stomach as the postman delivers a sealed envelope bearing a familiar hand, knowing that within lay carefully crafted words that could deepen a connection or subtly hint at future intentions. You see, in an era without telephones or instant messaging, letters were the primary means of communication, especially between a potential suitor and yourself, a Victorian woman. Once initial introductions and chaperoned meetings progressed, letters became an essential part of courtship. These weren't casual notes, they were formal, often lengthy missives where gentlemen would express their admiration, inquire about your health and activities, and subtly convey their intentions. You, in turn, would compose equally careful replies, demonstrating your education, wit, and refinement, while maintaining an appropriate level of reserve. The frequency and tone of letters could signal the seriousness of a courtship, gradually moving from polite inquiries to more affectionate sentiments. This mainstream historical fact, the central role of extensive letter writing as a primary mode of communication during Victorian courtship, was crucial for developing relationships. Historians still argue whether the formality and time required for letter writing fostered deeper, more reflective communication and emotional bonds, or if it created a detached and idealized version of the suitor, hindering genuine personality from shining through. It's a bit like trying to get to know someone solely through their meticulously edited social media posts. You see a curated version, not the raw reality. You might spend hours crafting a reply, agonizing over every turn of phrase, ensuring your sentiments were expressed with appropriate modesty and wit, perhaps even asking your mother or a trusted friend to review it before sealing. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some very discreet Victorian lovers developed elaborate codes within their letters, using specific paper colors, ink types, or even unusual punctuation to convey secret messages that only they would understand, bypassing the prying eyes of chaperones or suspicious family members. Imagine a seemingly innocuous letter actually containing a hidden declaration of undying love, decipherable only by you. The quiet scratch of your pen, the gentle rustle of paper, and the anticipation of a reply filled your private moments. This diligent engagement with correspondence was not just a chore, it was a deliberate act of building a connection, a way to reveal aspects of your personality and intellect that might be constrained in public. It was through these carefully penned words exchanged back and forth that the emotional landscape of your courtship was slowly, methodically, and often passionately explored. As your courtship progressed through letters and chaperoned meetings, one aspect remained steadfastly off limits. This brings us to physical touch, strict limitations. Imagine trying to express burgeoning affection without the comfort of a casual touch, a lingering handhold, or even a simple embrace. For you, a Victorian woman, physical intimacy before marriage was almost entirely forbidden, a boundary rigorously enforced by societal norms and moral codes. You see, Victorian society placed an overwhelming emphasis on female purity and chastity. Any physical contact between an unmarried man and woman beyond the most formal and fleeting gestures, like a handshake upon arrival or departure if permitted, was deemed highly inappropriate and could severely compromise your reputation. Even holding hands, walking arm in arm, or sitting too close was generally taboo, especially in public or without a chaperone present. Such actions could lead to scandal, speculation about your loose morals, and significantly diminish your prospects for a respectable marriage. The only exception might be a brief, highly formalized engagement period, where a gentleman might be permitted a chaste kiss upon the hand or forehead. This mainstream historical fact, the severe restrictions on physical touch between unmarried men and women, was a defining characteristic of Victorian courtship. Historians still argue whether this absence of physical intimacy primarily fostered a greater focus on intellectual and emotional connection in courtship, or if it created immense frustration, repression, and a profound disconnect between romantic feelings and their physical expression. It's a bit like trying to learn to swim without ever getting into the water. You can understand the theory, but the practical experience is missing. You might find yourself yearning for a comforting touch, or interpreting a fleeting brush of sleeves as a momentous event, understanding that every physical interaction carried an immense symbolic weight and potential for social disaster. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some very strict families even discouraged engaged couples from spending too much time alone together, even after the formal announcement, fearing that even innocent proximity could lead to temptation and compromise.
Imagine being engaged to the man you love, but still largely forbidden from being alone with him for more than a few minutes. The quiet distance maintained between you and your suitor, the careful avoidance of accidental contact, and the pervasive
understanding that your body was off limits until marriage filled these interactions. This strict limitation on physical touch meant that expressions of affection had to be channeled through polite conversation, shared glances, thoughtful letters, or the symbolic language of flowers, making dating a uniquely cerebral and emotionally guarded experience where the body remained largely unspoken and untouched. With every interaction meticulously observed and physical touch forbidden, one element became your most precious asset in the Victorian dating landscape. This brings us to reputation's importance, safeguarding purity. Imagine the immense pressure you felt to maintain an unblemished public image, knowing that a single whisper of scandal, a momentary lapse in decorum, could irrevocably destroy your prospects for marriage and social standing. You see, for Victorian women, reputation was everything. Your purity and modesty were not just virtues, they were commodities central to your value as a potential wife. Any hint of impropriety, being seen unchaperoned with a man, engaging in overly familiar conversation, or even having your name associated with a minor scandal could lead to social ostracism. A compromised reputation meant you were no longer considered respectable or marriageable in the eyes of good society. Mothers and chaperones acted as vigilant guardians of this purity, constantly advising and monitoring your behavior. You were expected to be demure, modest, and above reproach in every aspect of your public and private life. This mainstream historical fact, the absolute centrality of an unblemished reputation, particularly female purity, to a Victorian woman's marital prospects, was a pervasive and often terrifying aspect of courtship. Historians still argue whether this intense focus on female purity primarily protected women from exploitation in a society with limited legal recourse, or if it created a suffocating environment of anxiety and repression, fostering hypocrisy and a profound fear of social judgment. It's a bit like living in a glass house where every movement is visible and every imperfection magnified. You might be safe from outside threats, but you're constantly exposed to scrutiny. You might find yourself carefully choosing your words, ensuring your gaze was always modest, and avoiding any situation that could be misinterpreted, knowing that your entire future hinged on maintaining this delicate facade of innocence. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian etiquette manuals contained detailed instructions on how to subtly withdraw from a conversation or physically distance yourself if a gentleman became too forward or inappropriate, emphasizing that a lady should never risk her reputation by engaging with impropriety. Imagine having a codified strategy for politely escaping an uncomfortable conversation, all designed to protect your virtue. The quiet weight of societal expectations, the constant self-monitoring, and the pervasive fear of social ruin defined your behavior. This relentless safeguarding of your purity meant that dating was a constant performance of virtue, where every action was weighed against its potential impact on your reputation. Your future, your standing, and your very identity were inextricably linked to the perception of your unblemished moral character in the unforgiving gaze of Victorian society. While your reputation was paramount, the ultimate decision-makers in your courtship often had a very practical eye focused on a specific aspect of any suitor. This brings us to financial considerations. Suitors' prospects. Imagine your parents, perhaps sitting in their study with a ledger open, meticulously discussing a potential suitor's inheritance, his profession, and his expected future earnings. For them, and by extension for you, a Victorian woman, marriage was as much an economic arrangement as a romantic one. You see, in Victorian society, where women generally had no independent means of financial support and were legally dependent on their husbands, a man's economic prospects were a critical factor in marriage. Your parents, acting as your guardians and protectors, would meticulously vet any potential suitor's financial stability, his family's wealth, his profession's standing, and his potential for future advancement. A good marriage was one that secured your financial future and maintained or even elevated your family's social status. Love and affection, while desirable, were often secondary to the pragmatic necessity of a secure livelihood. A gentleman might be charming, but if his prospects were poor, he would likely be deemed unsuitable. This mainstream historical fact, the overriding importance of a suitor's financial stability and prospects in Victorian courtship, was a primary concern for families arranging marriages. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on financial considerations primarily led to stable, well-provided-for marriages, albeit sometimes devoid of passionate love, or if it stifled individual choice and forced women into purely transactional unions, leading to personal dissatisfaction. It's a bit like choosing a house for its sturdy foundation and good investment potential rather than its aesthetic beauty. It might be sensible, but it might not inspire joy. You might find yourself subtly assessing a suitor's attire for signs of prosperity, listening intently to his discussions about his profession, or even discreetly inquiring about his family's estates, knowing that these details held the key to your future security. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some families of unmarried daughters kept detailed marriage market ledgers, meticulously recording information about eligible bachelors, including their income, property, and family connections, almost like a financial prospectus for potential husbands. Imagine your parents having a literal spreadsheet detailing the net worth of every eligible man in your social circle. The quiet tension of financial scrutiny, the unspoken calculations of dowry and inheritance, and the sober assessment of future prospects permeated the seemingly romantic world of courtship. This practical emphasis on a suitor's financial standing meant that your personal feelings, while important, were often weighed against the cold, hard realities of economic survival and social advancement, making dating a deeply pragmatic affair. For Victorian women and their families, your future comfort was quite literally a numbers game. Even if a suitor's financial prospects were excellent, your personal preferences could only go so far. The ultimate decision rested with those who held the authority. This brings us to parental approval, family's decisive role. Imagine the quiet discussions your parents held in their study, perhaps after a suitor's visit, weighing his character, his family's reputation, and his financial standing. Their verdict for you, a Victorian woman, was almost always the final one, dictating your marital destiny. You see, for most Victorian women, especially in the middle and upper classes, marriage was considered a family affair, not solely an individual choice. While romantic love was increasingly idealized, parental consent was absolutely crucial for any engagement to be considered legitimate and socially respectable. Your parents, primarily your father, had the legal right and societal expectation to approve or disapprove of any suitor. They acted as gatekeepers, ensuring that a match was suitable in terms of social standing, financial security, and moral character. Their decision was often influenced by a desire to maintain or improve the family's position, and they would conduct thorough inquiries into the suitor's background, debts, and potential inheritances. Disobeying your parents' wishes regarding a marriage could lead to disinheritance, social ostracism, and a profound rupture within the family. This mainstream historical fact, the indispensable role of parental approval in Victorian courtship and marriage, was a significant limitation on a woman's autonomy. Historians still argue whether the dominance of parental approval primarily protected young women from rash decisions and ensured their financial security, or if it suppressed individual desires and forced women into loveless marriages for the sake of social or economic advantage. It's a bit like having a very strict committee approve all your life choices. They might have your best interests at heart, but you lose a lot of personal freedom. You might find yourself subtly trying to sway your parents' opinions, perhaps by highlighting a suitor's virtues or downplaying his flaws, all while knowing that their ultimate decision held undeniable power over your future. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some extreme cases, particularly among the aristocracy, parents would enter into detailed marriage settlements that dictated the financial terms of the union even before the engaged couple had much say, effectively treating their children as valuable assets in a dynastic merger. Imagine your future financial life being mapped out by lawyers before you'd even picked out a wedding dress. The quiet tension of family discussions, the weight of parental expectations, and the understanding that your deepest desires might be secondary to familial strategy defined this stage of courtship. This absolute reliance on parental approval meant that dating for a Victorian woman was often less about personal choice and more about navigating a complex family negotiation, where your happiness was often, but not always, aligned with your family's pragmatic interests. Your parents' blessing was the definitive hurdle on your path to the altar. Once parental approval was secured and a suitor's intentions were clear, the next significant step in your journey as a Victorian woman was a very public declaration. This brings us to the engagement period, formalized commitment. Imagine the collective sigh of relief and excitement as your family formally announced your impending marriage, transforming your private hopes into a public reality. This period, though relatively brief by today's standards, was packed with its own set of rules and expectations. You see, a Victorian engagement was not merely a private agreement between two individuals, it was a legally binding contract and a public announcement of intent to marry. Once engaged, you and your fiancé were considered plighted, and society largely accepted that you were committed to each other. This period allowed the couple to spend more time together, albeit still largely chaperoned, and to solidify their understanding of each other's characters and habits before marriage. It was also a time for families to finalize financial settlements, discuss wedding plans, and prepare the bride's trousseau. The length of engagement varied, but it was generally long enough for practical arrangements to be made, but not so long as to invite gossip or speculation. This mainstream historical fact, the engagement as a formal, publicly acknowledged and legally weighty commitment, was a crucial phase in Victorian courtship. Historians still argue whether the formal engagement period primarily provided a necessary opportunity for couples to truly know each other before marriage, or if it intensified social pressures, making it incredibly difficult to back out of an unsuitable match once the announcement was made. It's a bit like buying a house after only seeing the blueprints. You get a better idea of the layout, but you haven't lived in it yet. You might find yourself enjoying slightly more relaxed conversations with your fiancé, discussing your future, home, or perhaps making plans for children, all while keenly aware that the entire social world was now watching your every move as an engaged couple. Here's a quirky tidbit. It became fashionable for engaged couples to exchange engagement rings, often featuring a diamond or a special gemstone, symbolizing the permanence and preciousness of their bond, a tradition that became much more widespread during this era. Imagine wearing a sparkling symbol on your finger that literally announced your committed status to the entire world. The quiet satisfaction of knowing your future was settled, the polite congratulations from friends and family, and the increasing anticipation of your wedding day filled this time. This formalized period, far from being a simple romantic interlude, was a demanding transition, solidifying your bond, preparing you for married life, and making your commitment public and almost irreversible, a definitive marker in your journey through Victorian dating. While an engagement was a joyous public declaration, it also came with a significant unspoken pressure, and for some, the commitment proved too much. This brings us to broken engagements, social stigma. Imagine the quiet shame and humiliation if, after a formal announcement, your engagement was suddenly called off. For you, a Victorian woman, this was not simply a personal heartbreak. It was a devastating social catastrophe that could irrevocably damage your future prospects. You see, a Victorian engagement was considered a quasi-legal contract, almost as binding as marriage itself. Breaking an engagement, particularly by the woman, was seen as a serious breach of promise and honor. For the woman, a broken engagement carried immense social stigma. It could raise questions about her character, her purity, or her desirability, suggesting that she was somehow damaged goods. Society might speculate about why the engagement ended, often blaming the woman, even if the man was at fault. While a man could, in theory, be sued for breach of promise to marry, and some were, the social consequences for a woman were far more dire and long-lasting, potentially making it very difficult for her to secure another suitable match. This mainstream historical fact, the severe social stigma attached to a broken engagement for Victorian women, made backing out of a commitment a terrifying prospect. Historians still argue whether the extreme social pressure to maintain an engagement primarily ensured commitment and prevented frivolous unions, or if it trapped women in unsuitable or even abusive relationships out of fear of public disgrace. It's a bit like buying a non-refundable ticket for a very long journey. Once you've committed, turning back is incredibly costly, no matter how much you dislike the destination. You might find yourself agonizing over a growing doubt about your fiancé, desperately weighing your personal unhappiness against the crushing weight of public shame, understanding that ending the engagement could mean facing a life of spinsterhood or a greatly diminished social standing. Here's a quirky tidbit. To try and salvage a reputation after a broken engagement, families sometimes concocted elaborate stories or even moved to a new town or city, hoping a fresh start might erase the stain of the past. Imagine relocating your entire life just to escape the gossip about a cancelled wedding, the quiet whispers, the averted gazes, and the palpable sense of failure define the aftermath of a broken engagement. This intense social pressure meant that for a Victorian woman, dating was a process with incredibly high stakes, where a public commitment once made was almost impossible to undo without enduring profound and lasting social repercussions. The path to the altar was fraught with peril, and turning back was often worse than going forward, even into an unfulfilling marriage. In this carefully choreographed world of courtship, you, a Victorian woman, often found yourself balancing deeply personal desires with the practical necessities of your era. This brings us to love versus duty, conflicting ideals. Imagine the internal tug-of-war as your heart might yearn for a passionate connection, while your mind and your family pushed for a match based on financial security and social standing. This wasn't a choice between good and bad, but often between two compelling yet often opposing paths. You see, while romantic love was gaining traction as a desirable component of marriage throughout the Victorian era, partially fueled by populace, novels and poetry, it rarely superseded the pragmatic considerations of duty, family honor, and financial stability. For a Victorian woman, marrying for love alone, if it meant sacrificing social position or economic security, was often considered irresponsible, even reckless. Conversely, entering a marriage purely for financial gain, without any affection, was also increasingly seen as undesirable. Therefore, you were often expected to find a middle ground, to cultivate affection for a suitor who was also deemed suitable by your family's standards. Your duty to your family's prosperity and reputation often weighed heavily against your personal romantic inclinations. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive tension between the ideal of romantic love and the practical necessities of duty and social standing in Victorian courtship, defined the emotional landscape for many women. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on duty primarily ensured stable, functional marriages that benefited society, or if it led to widespread emotional suppression and unfulfilled lives for women whose romantic desires were secondary to their pragmatic obligations. It's a bit like being told to choose a life partner from a catalogue. You might find some attractive features, but true chemistry is hard to quantify. You might find yourself trying to convince your heart to align with your head, seeking out qualities in a suitable suitor that could foster affection, or perhaps quietly grieving the loss of a romantic ideal that simply couldn't withstand the harsh realities of your world. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some desperate young women would keep dream journals detailing their romantic fantasies and idealized partners, a private escape from the more mundane and duty-bound realities of their
Actual courtship prospects.
Imagine writing passionate prose about a fictional suitor while politely entertaining a perfectly suitable but utterly uninspiring real one. the quiet conflict within your own heart, the constant negotiation between what you desired and what was expected, defined your internal experience of dating. This tension between love and duty meant that dating for a Victorian woman was often a complex psychological balancing act, where your personal happiness was inextricably linked to, and often overshadowed by, the broader responsibilities to your family and your future security. Finally, as we reflect on the multifaceted world of Victorian courtship, it's vital to acknowledge that your experience as a woman would vary dramatically depending on your social standing. This brings us to class differences, varied courtship, norms. Imagine the stark contrast between a debutante gliding through a London ballroom and a factory girl meeting a suitor at a noisy fairground. Each woman was navigating a dating landscape unique to her station, governed by vastly different rules and expectations. You see, while our previous discussions have largely focused on the experiences of middle and upper-class women who adhered to the strict rules of chaperonage, formal introductions and social seasons, courtship for working-class women was a much less formalized affair, dictated by economic necessity and communal living. For these women, opportunities to meet men might arise at the factory, the market, a public house, or local dances. Chaperonage was often impractical or impossible, and interactions were more direct and less constrained by rigid etiquette. While reputation was still important, the emphasis shifted from virginal purity to a more pragmatic understanding of respectability within their community. Financial considerations were paramount, but often focused on whether a man could provide any stable income rather than accumulating wealth. Love, though still a factor, might blossom from shared hardship and mutual support rather than polite, drawing-room conversations. This mainstream historical fact, the profound class-based variations in Victorian courtship norms, underscores that there was no single Victorian woman's dating experience. Historians still argue whether the less formal courtship of the working classes allowed for greater personal choice and genuine emotional connection, or if it left women more vulnerable to exploitation and less protected by societal structures. It's a bit like comparing a carefully cultivated greenhouse plant to a wildflower growing in an open field, both beautiful but shaped by fundamentally different environments. You might find yourself, as a working-class woman, engaging in public banter with a suitor, walking home with him unchaperoned after a long shift, or relying on community gossip to assess his character rather than formal inquiries or elaborate calling card rituals. Here's a quirky tidbit. Among some working-class communities, walking out became a common, less formal stage of courtship, where a couple would simply be seen together regularly in public, signaling their mutual interest, without a formal engagement or extensive parental vetting. Imagine simply being seen with someone as the primary declaration of your serious intentions. The quiet hum of factory machinery, the lively chatter of a market, or the shared struggle for daily bread often formed the backdrop to these relationships. Your dating experience, whether defined by the rustle of a ball gown or the sturdy practicalities of daily labor, was inextricably linked to your place in society. This meant that the hopes, anxieties, and eventual realities of courtship for Victorian women were as diverse as the society itself, a testament to the varied paths women took on their journey toward marriage in an era of profound social stratification. As the gaslights dim and the hum of the city outside fades, you can almost hear the rustle of a crinoline at a ball, the quiet scratch of a pen on a love letter, and the unspoken hopes and fears of women navigating a complex path to partnership. Let the anxieties of a bygone era, the strictures and the surprising joys of Victorian courtship gently recede now. The history, the knowledge, the quiet insights into how lives were lived now drifts away on the soft currents of your breath. Allow yourself to loosen your grip on the day's thoughts, letting them soften and blur. The whispers of the past are becoming fainter, merging with the calm, steady rhythm of your own heart. All the complexities, all the worries, all the curious details, they are simply sounds now, fading into the comfortable quiet. Just listen to the soft hush, feel the peaceful stillness surrounding you, and let your mind unwind. Sweet dreams.